end.
Oh, that's a class. You just said yes before you even abstained.
All right, so the
Oh, look, he got braces.
these two systems that we're talking about, both nervous and endocrine system, are really related, and we consider them both systems that help regulate homeostasis and regulate various body functions. The nervous system is one means, and then the endocrine system is another means, and they work through different ways, but they are interconnected, and they do have some overlap. So, let's see.
That's a really big forehead. Like,
All right. So when we talk about the endocrine system, talking about the body's system of glands and hormones. And hormones are very important to know about. Okay? So really, all organisms, even the most simple of living things, have some means of chemical control over how they function. Even if it's a single-celled organism, various chemicals that are released within the cell can regulate how that cell works, when it reproduces, and so forth. And so the endocrine system, this chemical regulation system, works through a system of hormones. And a hormone is basically a very small molecule, generally a protein, that is produced by certain glands that we call endocrine glands. And these hormones are secreted into the blood and travel throughout the body and have certain effects on some target tissue that's somewhere else. So hormones are produced in a gland but affect tissue somewhere else in the body. The way they reach that other tissue is through the blood. And so an important fact to know is a key piece of information is that it's the shape of these molecules that is so important. Just like when we talked about enzymes, the shape of the enzyme fits in perfectly with its substrate. The shape of hormone molecules fits in perfectly with receptor molecules that are inside of the cell or outside of the cell on the cell membrane. The shapes match up, and that's how these messages are sent. Okay? The shape of the hormone matches some receptor. So here you see just a diagram that shows, if this is a model of a cell, on the cell membrane there may be receptors. Okay? And if the cell has these receptors, they fit in and match up with hormone A. Hormone B would not enter, would not attach to these receptors, so it would have no effect on this cell. This would be a target cell that is affected by both hormone A and hormone B because it has both receptors. And this one would only be affected by hormone B because of those receptors. So that's why testosterone can be produced and be in our blood and reaching all cells of our body, but only affecting certain tissues, because only those tissues have the proper receptor molecules, okay, that regulate how that hormone has its effects. Hormones do all sorts of different things inside of a living organism. They regulate many things: metabolism, homeostasis, growth, reproduction, development. All those things are regulated by hormones. The nervous system, we know, works pretty quickly, not instantly, but quickly, because nerve impulses are transmitted very fast. However, the endocrine system works more slowly, because for hormones to be produced in one gland, enter our bloodstream, travel around our body, and have an effect somewhere else, well, that takes a little bit more time. Okay, so the endocrine system works more slowly than the nervous system does, but often the effects last longer than changes caused by the nervous system. So we're talking in this section mostly about endocrine glands. The definition of an endocrine gland, it's a gland that is ductless, that secretes a substance directly into the blood. Hormones like testosterone, insulin, TSH, and a whole host of other hormones which we will talk about. There are also glands that are called exocrine glands. And these secrete substances through ducts to the area they're going to be used. Things like salivary glands, they secrete saliva directly into our mouth through a little duct, a little tube. That's an exocrine gland. Okay? Sweat glands, mammary glands, they produce a substance and then release it through a duct. Then there's some other molecules that are called prostaglandins. And these are sort of hormones that work in a specific local area. They're released somewhere and they affect the cells in that area. They're not traveling through the blood to another location. They affect cells that are nearby. There's sort of two major classes of hormones that can be further divided, but for our purposes, we'll just talk about a couple. There's steroid hormones and non-steroid hormones. Right? There's several types of these non-steroid hormones, but we're not going to really get into the details. And the difference between these two types of hormones is important. Steroid hormones are made of carbon rings. You see here are some diagrams of testosterone, of progesterone. These are two steroid hormones. And they're lipid-like hormones, which means they can pass through the cell membrane. So when a steroid hormone travels through the blood and gets to the target cells, it can pass through that cell membrane because it's lipid-like, and it is able to pass through that membrane. Remember, lipids and non-lipids don't generally mix well. And so that's going to be important when we talk about the non-steroid hormones. So the steroid hormones pass right through the cell membrane into the target cell, and they have some action within the cell. Often they act directly on the DNA. So they pass into the cell and regulate, turn on genes, they produce various proteins, turn off genes. They regulate many of those genes or messenger RNA. Okay? Examples, cortisone, testosterone, estrogen, these are steroid hormones. Now the non-steroid hormones, okay, they're made of other substances. They can be proteins, okay, and that's what they generally are, proteins, sections of proteins, amino acids. And these non-steroid hormones, they cannot actually enter the cell. So in order to have their effect within a cell, they can't actually get into the cell. So they need sort of a helper that can recognize that this hormone is present on the outside of the cell and then sort of relay that change to the inside of the cell. So these are called two messenger hormones. We'll look at a diagram showing this in the next slide. So what happens is once this hormone attaches to receptors on the outside of the cell membrane, it triggers a change within the cell to produce a second messenger that acts within the cell and has some effect. Insulin works like this, oxytocin, ACTH, and other hormones. So if we look at the difference in how these hormones work, how they function, this is what this diagram is showing. These steroid hormones, they travel directly through the cell membrane, get into the cell. This represents the cell, this represents the nucleus. So they actually get into the cell, where they can bind with a receptor, get into the nucleus, and regulate the DNA. Turn a gene on, turn a gene off, increase the production of certain proteins and so forth. So that's how they have those effects. They get into the cell directly. The non-steroid hormones, again, they cannot get into the cell, so instead they bind to a receptor protein on the outside, which then causes a secondary messenger to be produced or released. And that secondary messenger can then do its work inside of the cell and regulate, change the production of certain substances and so forth. So steroid hormones can go into the cell, non-steroid hormones cannot. But they both have effects on the cell, cause a change to happen within the cell. They just do it through different mechanisms. And these hormones work through a system of feedback. We've talked about homeostasis before. We've talked about feedback systems. Okay? They're very important. And these hormones are all sort of regulated through a system of feedback. You maintain homeostasis because the levels of various hormones are either stimulated or inhibited by other hormones, by other conditions. And we'll talk about some examples here. So an example of this feedback working would be with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland and the thyroid gland. All of these glands are sort of connected, and the levels of various hormones influence how each of these glands and parts of the endocrine nervous system work. So the hypothalamus is an important part of our endocrine system that sort of links up the nervous system to the endocrine system. Okay. So the hypothalamus is in the brain, connected to the thalamus, the part of the brain, and the hypothalamus produces these things called releasing factors. And these releasing factors are produced here in the hypothalamus, and they affect the pituitary gland, which is just below it. Pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland. It's deep within our brain. And it sort of directs almost all of the rest of the endocrine glands. So it's really important. So the hypothalamus produces various releasing factors, okay? And they stimulate the pituitary gland, cause it to start to produce certain hormones. One of the hormones it produces is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And thyroid stimulating hormone goes through the blood, okay, reaches the thyroid gland, and sort of turns it on. Okay, so it stimulates the production of hormones by the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland produces thyroxine and other hormones that regulate our metabolism. Okay? So if the thyroxine levels get too high, okay, that feedback is sent, and the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus sort of sense that. And when they sense that the thyroxine levels are getting too high, they basically adjust and shut down that process of stimulating the pituitary gland, and they can then inhibit and lower the functioning of the thyroid gland. Okay? Same thing. When the pituitary gland produces TSH, the hypothalamus is kind of monitoring that. And when it realizes that the amount of TSH is getting too high, it shuts down. And so there's this constant monitoring and adjusting of the hormones through this feedback system. That's how feedback works. You're monitoring conditions and making constant adjustments. And the example I gave you guys when we talked about it before was the thermostat. The thermostat monitors the temperature of the room. When it finds the temperature has gotten too high, sends a signal turning the heater off. When the temperature goes too low, it stimulates the heater to turn on. And so you have this constant monitoring and adjusting of conditions to maintain homeostasis, to maintain the proper balance. These are the main endocrine glands. This slide is I had a couple in your packet. Which one did I look at? Okay, I think I have that later on, hopefully. Oh yeah, so the one you have here, if you turn your paper sideways, is this diagram. And this is, again, it's kind of just showing this idea of homeostasis. And it's an example we've talked about before, insulin. We all know what's the purpose of insulin?
Blood sugar stuff.
Yeah, it helps regulate blood glucose. Specifically, what does it do to the amount of glucose in your blood?
It lowers it.
It lowers it. That's all insulin does. Okay? We need a proper level of glucose in our blood. Too much is bad for us. Stresses our kidneys. It can damage nerves. Too little glucose is bad. It can cause us to become weak, to pass out. Okay, so we need the proper amount. You know, about 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters is a normal blood glucose level. And so our pancreas, which is one of the endocrine glands, is regulating that. And so what we find, if our blood glucose level rises, okay, after we just ate a big bowl of Fruity Pebbles or whatever, as it rises, our pancreas is monitoring that. When it realizes our blood sugar level has gotten too high, okay, it turns on. There's special cells in the pancreas, the beta cells, okay, and they produce insulin. Insulin goes into our blood, travels all throughout our body. And what insulin does is it has an effect on various cells. It has a major effect on the liver. Basically, it tells the liver, hey, too much glucose in the blood, you need to take some out. And so glucose absorbs, the liver absorbs glucose from our blood and stores it for a while as glycogen. Does a similar sort of thing in our body cells. Tells cells of our body tissues, hey, too much glucose in the blood, take some in, get it out of the blood. And so that reduces the glucose level and hopefully we reach homeostasis. At the same time, if our blood glucose level drops, we haven't eaten all day, okay, and our blood glucose level is too low, again, cells in our pancreas, the alpha cells, realize this, and they produce a different hormone. They produce a hormone called glucagon. And glucagon does the opposite of insulin. And so it signals the liver, says, okay, we don't have enough glucose in the blood. You need to take some of that glycogen that you store, break it down, and release it into the blood as glucose. And so our blood glucose level goes back up and hopefully reaches homeostasis. So you have these two hormones constantly working together to balance blood glucose levels. If it drops too low, goes too high, these hormones help keep it at the proper level if a person is healthy. If a person has disease like diabetes, where the insulin producing cells in their pancreas have been damaged or destroyed, then they may need to monitor their own blood glucose and give themselves insulin injections or use an insulin pump to provide that insulin because their pancreas is not doing it. They need to find another way to maintain that homeostasis. All right, we're going to stop there. We'll talk more about all the various glands, what they do, as we move ahead tomorrow.